Miles was 42 years old. He'd already revolutionized jazz 3 times. He was rich, famous, respected. He had nothing left to prove. But watching Hendrix that night, Miles felt something he hadn't felt in years. Envy. Not envy of Hendrix's talent. Miles had plenty of that. Envy of his freedom. Hendrix was playing whatever he wanted, mixing blues and rock and jazz into something completely new. And the audience, young people, hippies, kids who'd never heard of bebop, were losing their minds. Miles looked around. These weren't jazz fans. These people had probably never listened to Kind of Blue. They didn't care about modal scales or bebop or anything Miles had spent 30 years mastering. They just wanted music that made them feel something. Miles went home that night and couldn't sleep. Jazz had become museum music, respected, analyzed, preserved like it was already dead. Jazz clubs were half empty. Young people were listening to rock. Miles was the biggest name in jazz, and jazz was dying. But what Hendrix was doing, that was alive. That was the future, and Miles wanted to be part of it. Over the next 2 years, Miles started changing his music. He added electric instruments. He brought in rock rhythms. He started playing what would eventually be called jazz fusion, taking everything he knew about jazz and marrying it to the raw power of rock. Critics hated it. Jazz purists called it betrayal. But Miles didn't care. He'd seen the future that night at the Electric Circus, and the future was electric. In early 1970, Miles reached out through mutual friends to see if Jimmy would be interested in recording together. The message came back within days. Jimmy was very interested. They set up a phone call. Miles and Jimmy, 2 geniuses from completely different worlds, talking about making music together. "I want to do something nobody's heard before," Miles told him. "Not jazz, not rock, something new." Jimmy understood immediately. "Man, I've been trying to get there myself. Everything sounds the same. I want to break out." They talked for over an hour. About music, about freedom, about how both of them felt trapped by what people expected them to be. Miles was supposed to play jazz. Jimmy was supposed to play rock. But what if they could create something that was neither and both? By the end of the call, they'd agreed. They would record an album together, a full collaboration. Miles's band, Jimmy's guitar, no rules, no expectations, just create. They set a date, September 18th, 1970, Columbia's studios in New York. Miles started making plans. He talked to his producer about the session. He started thinking about which musicians from his band would work best with Jimmy's style. He started sketching out ideas for the kind of sound they might create. Jimmy was equally excited. He'd been feeling constrained by the expectations of the rock world. Everyone wanted him to be the wild guitar god. Nobody wanted to hear him explore the jazz and blues roots that had shaped him. Recording with Miles would give him permission to do something different. In the months leading up to the session, both of them mentioned the collaboration in interviews. Miles told a reporter that he and Jimmy were going to change what people think music can be. Jimmy told friends he was more excited about this session than anything he'd done in years. September 1970 arrived. The studio was booked. Columbia had cleared the schedule. Miles's band knew to keep September 18th open. Everything was ready. But September 17th, the day before the session, Miles was in New York, preparing, going through ideas, thinking about what tomorrow might bring. Jimmy was in London, finishing up some obligations there. He was supposed to fly to New York that evening, arriving early morning on the 18th, giving him time to rest before the afternoon session. That night in London, Jimmy attended a party. He took some sleeping pills, drank some wine, a combination he'd done before without incident. But this time was different. Early morning, September 18th, Jimmy's girlfriend found him unconscious. Ambulance arrived, rushed him to the hospital. He was pronounced dead at 11:45 a.m. London time, 6:45 a.m. in New York. Miles woke up that morning excited. Today was the day. Today he and Jimmy were going to create something the world had never heard. His phone rang at 7:30 a.m. It was his producer. "Miles, I don't know how to tell you this. Jimmy's dead." Miles didn't speak for a long time. "What do you mean dead?" "London, this morning. They're saying it was an accident. Sleeping pills and alcohol." Miles hung up the phone and sat in silence. They were supposed to record in 7 hours. The studio was booked. The band was ready. Everything was in place. And Jimmy was dead. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Miles went to the studio anyway. He didn't know why. Maybe he thought if he showed up somehow it wouldn't be real. The studio was empty except for the engineer, who didn't know whether to leave Miles alone or try to say something comforting. Miles sat at the piano in the empty studio, in the space where he and Jimmy were supposed to create something revolutionary, and he cried. "We were supposed to record today," he told the engineer. "Right now, we were supposed to be making music." The engineer didn't know what to say. Miles stayed in the studio for an hour, just sitting there, in the room where history was supposed to be made, in the silence where music was supposed to be made, in the silence where music was supposed to be. Then he left, and the collaboration that was supposed to change music died with Jimi Hendrix. In the decades since, musicians and music historians have speculated endlessly about what that album might have sounded like. Miles's band at the time included some of the most innovative musicians in jazz. Jimmy, at the peak of his powers, was arguably the most revolutionary guitarist in rock. Together, they might have created an album that bridged the gap between rock and jazz years before anyone else. They might have influenced an entire generation differently. They might have created a sound that we still haven't heard, because it died before it could be born. John McLaughlin, the guitarist who later played with Miles and pioneered jazz-rock fusion, said, "If Miles and Jimmy had recorded together in 1970, it would have changed everything. The fusion movement would have started 5 years earlier and sounded completely different." Herbie Hancock, who knew both Miles and Jimmy, said, "Those two together would have been dangerous. Both of them were fearless. Both of them were willing to fail in pursuit of something new. An album with both of them would have been either a disaster or the greatest thing anyone had ever made. My money's on the greatest thing." Carlos Santana, who was influenced by both Miles and Jimmy, tried to imagine what it would have sounded like. Jimmy had this raw emotional power. Miles had this cool, sophisticated intelligence. Putting them together, it's like combining fire and ice. You'd get something nobody had heard before. The closest we ever got to hearing what Miles and Jimmy might have created together came from the music they made separately after that meeting in 1968. Miles's album Bitches Brew, recorded in 1969, showed the influence of Jimmy's rock sensibility, electric instruments, rock rhythms, a rawness that jazz had lost. Jimmy's later work showed him moving toward jazz, more improvisation, more complex harmonies, an adventurousness that went beyond standard rock structures. They were both moving toward the same place, a fusion of jazz sophistication and rock power, but they were supposed to get there together. Instead, they each walked part of the path alone, and the music that would have happened when those paths converged died on September 18, 1970, in an empty recording studio in New York. For the rest of his life, Miles rarely talked about the collaboration that never happened. It was too painful, but occasionally, in interviews, someone would ask him about Jimmy. "We were supposed to record," Miles would say. "We had it all planned. The studio was booked, and then he was gone. What do you think the album would have sounded like?" An interviewer asked him in 1989. Miles was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. I think about it sometimes. I think it would have been something nobody had heard before." Jimmy was ready to break out of being a rock guitarist. I was ready to break out of being a jazz musician. Together, we might have created something completely new. "Do you wish you'd had more time to make it happen? Started earlier?" Miles shook his head. "We couldn't have done it earlier. I wasn't ready in 1968. Jimmy wasn't ready. By 1970, we were both ready. We were both in the right place, and then time ran out." He paused. "That's the thing about creating something new. You have to wait until the moment is right, and sometimes the moment comes and goes before you can catch it. The studio that was booked for September 18, 1970 was used for other sessions, other albums, other music. But there are still people who know the story, who walk past that studio and think about what might have been, the album that was supposed to exist, the music that was supposed to change everything. In 1995, Columbia Records tried to create a posthumous collaboration using archival recordings. They took some of Miles's tracks from the early 1970s and some of Jimmy's unreleased recordings and tried to blend them together. It was well-intentioned, but ultimately unsatisfying. You can't create a collaboration after both artists are dead. You can't capture the magic of two geniuses in a room together, listening to each other, responding to each other, creating something in real time, the real collaboration. The one that was supposed to happen on September 18, 1970, exists only in the imagination. Music critics still write about it. The greatest album never made. The collaboration that could have changed music. Miles and Jimmy, what if? Young musicians still discover the story and feel the loss of something they never got to hear. And somewhere in the universe of unmade music, there exists an album that Miles Davis and Jimi Hendrix created together. An album that pushed both rock and jazz into new territory. An album that influenced a generation of musicians who never got to hear it. But in our universe, September 18, 1970, was just an empty studio, a broken-hearted trumpet player, and the silence where music was supposed to be. Miles Davis died in 1991, 21 years after Jimmy. At Miles's funeral, several musicians mentioned the collaboration that never happened, how it would have been revolutionary, how music might have been different if that one night in London had gone differently. But perhaps the real legacy of the Miles and Jimmy collaboration that never happened isn't what they would have created together. Perhaps it's what they created separately while thinking about what they might create together. Miles's fusion albums of the 1970s, Jimmy's later work pushing the boundaries of rock, both of them reaching towards something new, something that combined the intelligence of jazz with the raw power of rock. They never got to create it together, but they both created pieces of it alone. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the collaboration that never happened still changed music, just not in the way anyone expected. Or maybe music lost something irreplaceable on September 18th, 1970. We'll never know. Subscribe for more stories about collaborations that never happened, about the music we almost heard, and about the moments when history turned on a single night. Because sometimes the most influential albums are the ones that were never made,